right, we have got a lot of people who have just joined us, so I want to welcome everybody today on behalf of the Virginia Education Opportunity Alliance. We are very fortunate today to have two of the lead experts in the education freedom movement in the country and now in the world, because Dr. McShane is in Ireland right now. So we got people from all over the place. But we're very fortunate to have them. They study this stuff. They have for a long time, and they're going to share with us today what the work they're doing on what does it look like to not eliminate borders around education, but to try to provide solutions to the restrictions that borders provide. I'm going to start off with introducing our two guests, and then they're going to make their presentation. And then we've got a number of questions that came through the registration, but if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and Lindsay will make sure I get them, and we'll go from there. So today we have Marty Lukin, who Chris Allen and I have worked with now for, it's probably going on 7 or 8 years. I think we started working with Marty when we first introduced education savings accounts. Marty is director of EdChoice's Fiscal Research and Education Center, where he focuses on research and analysis of issues that pertain to school choice, current programs, and school funding. His work includes providing expert support and advice for policymakers in helping understand the fiscal impact of current school choice programs and potential fiscal effects of programs introduced in state legislatures. He also conducts data analysis and research on school choice. His work has been mentioned in various media and education-specific outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Education Next, Education Week, and the 74. Dr. Michael McShane is the editor of New and Better Schools, the author of Education and Opportunity, and co-editor of Education Entrepreneurship Today, Teacher Quality 2.0, and Common Core Meets Education Reform. His analyses and commentary have been published widely in the media as well, including the Huffington Post, National Affairs, USA Today, and the Washington Post. In addition to authoring numerous white papers, Dr. McShane has had academic work published in Education, Finance, and Policy and the Journal of School Choice. A former high school teacher, he earned a PhD in Education Policy from the University of Arkansas and an M.Ed from the University of Notre Dame and a BA in English from St. Louis University. As you can tell, both of these gentlemen are very well qualified to be having a conversation on this. And I'm going to let you guys take it from here.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to speak today. And I really appreciate all of the work that you all are doing. We were just kind of getting the download before we went live here. Maybe some of the school choice stuff didn't go as well as you would have hoped this year. But, we at EdChoice have been around for 25 years. And obviously we're experiencing unprecedented positive school choice movement now, but sometimes you can forget the previous 24 years where it was a lot of laboring in the wilderness. It was a lot of educating people, a lot of building coalitions, stops and starts, successes and failures. And so I would be remiss if I didn't begin by saying, I'm sorry to hear about what happened this year, but I trust that as you all continue to work towards this, as we look at the examples from states all across the country, building that coalition, making those important arguments, you will get there. We have confidence you will get there. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Let me make sure this is showing up the way I want it to. Can everyone see when I put it like this? I think I want to put, is this now the full screen? Maybe Craig or Lindsay, if you want to give me the thumbs up that I'm doing this correctly. All right, rock and roll. Okay, so our talk today is based on a paper that Marty and I wrote for the Manhattan Institute. It's called K-12 Without Borders. You can check it out. We're going to do the kind of movie trailer version of it. We're not going to give all, 10 or 12,000 words of it to you all. I don't know if any of you are suffering from insomnia or something like that, which we could cure, but we won't. We want to give you the key hits to it. And I think like Craig very accurately said, what we're trying to do in this paper is think about the borders that exist in K-12 education. how they impact various stakeholder groups, whether that's students and families, whether that's teachers, which I think is an area we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, and is one that's kind of under discussed when we think about the way the system is arranged and possible changes to it, but also think about homeowners and taxpayers, which is an interesting constituency that sometimes we also have kind of under discussed when it comes to talking about school choice. Now, the way this story starts in this paper is we begin with this image. We describe it with words, but the beauty of this presentation we're doing today is I can actually give you the picture. This is in suburban St. Louis, Missouri. And we are on Dealman Road here. And we both, Marty is originally from St. Louis. I went to college in St. Louis. My family's from St. Louis. We're both Missouri boys. And so if we had to pick, there are more than 13,000 school districts in America, and you could pick almost any of their borders, but we tried to pick something close to home. But this is a particularly stark illustration of what some of the borders look like in American education. Because if you look down Dealman Road here, whether you're in the foreground or whether you're in the background, right? Any way you look down this road, you basically see the same place, right? Yes, there are some railroad tracks there. I think if you look closely, there's the River Des Peres is winding there. But what you don't see is the border between two school districts. Just past the railroad tracks there is the Ladue School District. And where this picture is being taken from is the Ritenour School District. Ladue is one of the highest performing school districts in the state of Missouri. The most recent data we had, if you look at math scores, English language arts scores, you're talking 70-75% of students scoring in the proficient or advanced range. Ritenour, where this picture is being taken, we're more looking like in the 20s and 30% in English language arts and mathematics. Now, this border is kind of a wild one. Well, I can actually show you what it looks like on a map. These are all of the school districts that exist in the greater St. Louis area. And many of these districts, including the two that we were just talking about, their borders don't actually line up with anything in particular. They're not municipal borders. They're not county borders. The Ladue School District, the one that was sort of far in the district, has 10 different municipalities that are in it. The Ritenour School District has 9 different municipalities. They're all within the same county. So what you see is these borders that have grown up over time. I think the Ritenour School District was founded in something like the 1880s. But over time, as population grew, these borders start to emerge. And they play an incredibly important role in shaping the opportunities that children have, in shaping property values, real estate transactions, and a lot of those issues. And they really can shape the way teachers are able to do their work. So what our paper is about is thinking about these borders, thinking about changes to these borders and what the effects of those changes might be. So, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that it didn't potentially work out as well in Virginia this year. But 2023 has been a year of incredible educational choice advancements. So in January, Iowa and Utah passed laws creating education savings accounts program that over the course of the next couple of years will grow to near universal eligibility. Arkansas did something similar in early March with their LEARNS Act, which also paired with it a lot of actually kind of interesting teacher pay, a lot of other reforms that were tied into it. And just recently, Florida expanded its ESA program to grow again to almost universal eligibility. This joins, for those of you that are familiar, I'm sorry that it's so close to you, but West Virginia, we've got it on the and Arizona, 2 states. So from 3 or 4 years ago, where we saw 0 states having programs of this massive side, in a very short period of time, we've seen this incredible growth of educational choice. And what that means is a lot of these borders are becoming less salient. If you have an ESA program, a school district boundary or others doesn't matter as much as others do. And this is just looking at the private school choice level, where this has been particularly stark. But we've also seen states across the country expand charter schooling, reform charter schooling, increase funding for charter schooling to really help the growth of that sector. And we've seen a lot of work around intra and inter-district open enrollment, where students stay within the traditional public school system, but they have more choice either within the school district that they live in or across the borders. We'll talk about a bit more about that in a moment. But we want to kind of pause before we dive into talking about change. Many of you may be familiar with the British philosopher and theologian G.K. Chesterton, novelist as well. He was kind of a polymath. He did a lot of different things. But one of my favorite lessons that he preached, a maxim, if you will, was this idea that has become known as Chesterton's fence. And what Chesterton's fence posits is, if you happen upon a fence in a field, do not tear that fence down until you know why it was put there in the first place. It's incredibly good good advice in your life. It's very good in public policy, because a lot of times things exist and we might not know why they are there, but they could exist for very good reasons. And in our zeal to change things or to, want to do new and different things, we could end up destroying things that are actually good and useful. So we want to think about school district boundaries and some of the boundaries that we have that Marty will be talking around things like state pension systems and others. And why did they emerge the way that they did? And what do they actually look like today if we're going to change them? So as I said, we want to look at this current system, the current system of borders, taking into account sort of Chesterton's fence ideas from these three different perspectives: students, homeowners, and teachers. The most stark case that we see, and the one that probably everyone on this call, if you're involved in the school choice movement, you already know what I'm going to talk about here, right? If we assign students to schools based on where they live, if we hem them in based on school district boundaries that are related to where students live, as we write in the paper, access to quality schools can depend on a family's wealth or income. And boundaries in the current system can create a major obstacle for low-income families to access better schools. By the way, this picture that's here is actually a public school. It is in suburban Chicago. But it sort of really greatly illustrates how some of the disparities that we can see between different school districts. And some of that relates to property wealth or equalization formulas, but it's not even necessarily as much that. But it's about the population that schools serve, the organizational structure, all of those sorts of things that exist there. So one of these things that we know about school districts is that, like we saw in the example that started this story between Ledoux and Rittenhour, that there are some kids that are just unlucky, right? They happen to live 1 or 2 blocks on the wrong side of one of those borders. Their house looks the same. All of these things are so similar to one another, but because they live on that particular line, the sort of wrong side of that line, they do not have access to the same quality schools as someone who lives on the other side of that line. So again, I don't think we're really breaking any new ground when we're telling the folks that are on this call that the current way in which we organize schooling can be profoundly unfair and inequitable for lots of students across the country. I think where this paper really makes a contribution is thinking about other groups, though. The case is so clear-cut with respect to students. But what does it mean for other groups like homeowners and teachers? Marty is going to handle mostly the teacher group, but I'm going to handle just very briefly here looking at homeowners. One of the things, and we summarize a lot of research in the paper on this, so I'm just going to sort of cut to the chase for all of you, is this idea that higher quality schools drive up home prices in the areas that are zoned for those schools. Some of the best research that we have about that is that sort of on average, we see about 4% of a home's value can vary based on a standard deviation increase in school test scores. So again, that's at the average. There's some that are less than that, and there are some that are more than that. And if we look at sort of the median home price in America, we're basically saying about $18,000, $19,000 of a home's price of its value is tied up in the quality of the schools that are around it. And look, in some ways, this could be a good thing, right? It definitely creates a class of people that have a vested interest in schools doing well, right? If your home price is tied to the quality of the schools, maybe you want to get involved in school board elections more. Maybe you want to become more invested in the schools to make sure that they're good. So there could be, thinking back to, again, Chesterton's fence, there could be some good reasons why these things exist. But on the flip side, there are some problems with this, right? The first one that we sort of already mentioned is that insofar as higher quality schools drive up home prices, that can prevent some lower income students from being able to access those schools. And you could also have folks who just don't want they would much prefer their home's value to be connected to things that are more within their control, right? I want my home price to go up because I put a new roof on it, not because they built a new elementary school. So there are reasons why the sort of capitalization of home prices could maybe be a positive, but again, there are lots of these, whether it comes to how it affects low-income families, how it affects people who don't necessarily want this to be part of their home value, can definitely happen in a more negative way. So I'm going to hand it over to Marty for our third group, and I think this is one where, again, we don't spend, I think, nearly as much time really thinking about how teachers are hemmed in by some of the boundaries and the borders that exist in our K-12 system. So Marty, I'll advance the slide, but then hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Craig, for having us. Yeah, so when it comes to the K-12 education system and teachers, I think that what we want is a system that allows a free flow of teachers. So say areas with teacher shortages can be staffed by teachers from areas with excess labor, or perhaps teachers from other sectors like private schools or even other industries, right? Well, as it turns out, teachers can be locked in by pension borders, and certain groups of teachers can be disadvantaged and even placed at risk relative to others. So every state has a retirement system and offers their own retirement plans for public school teachers. Virginia has its own system, right? The Virginia retirement system, I believe. Most teachers are covered by what's known as a final salary defined benefit plan, where 90% of public school teachers nationwide, they have access to these plans, and 85% of those with access to them actually enroll in them. So these plans are intentionally designed to reward teachers who work in a system for a full career. And they're designed to disincentivize and i.e. penalize workers from leaving a system early. So teachers that work in a system for a full career, they can count on a secure retirement, but the story is different for other more mobile teachers. So why is that? Benefits under these systems accrue in a highly nonlinear, highly non-smooth manner over the course of a teacher's career. So I'll show you what that looks like shortly, but these accrual patterns, they occur because eligibility requirements for these plans are arbitrary. They're mostly based on, determined by one's age and one's year of service. And so this works to create like these very strong push-pull incentives to these key eligibility points. So by design, defined benefit plans are backloaded in nature. And that's because of they're designed specifically to reward stayers and penalize early leavers. And then finally, a lot of plans lack portability. That is, if a teacher leaves early, they can receive maybe a small pension benefit, or they can choose to get a refund of their contributions. Almost every plan does not allow them access to the employer contributions. So they would have access only to their contributions. Some plans provide interest, others do not. So Mike, if you can move to the next slide, please. So Equitable Institute analyzed the retirement security for public employee pension plans, where they looked at how well state-sponsored plans serve short-term teachers, how well they serve medium-term teachers, and how well they serve full career teachers. Of the 63 retirement plans, 55 works well for teachers who stay in a plan for a full career. They looked at all sorts of different factors, and all sorts of different things that factor into retirement security. For teachers who stay 10 to 20 years, just 5 plans serve those members well. And as for teachers who stay for 10 years or less, only 2 plans work well for those members. If you can go to the next slide. So this chart plots how pension wealth accrues for a representative teacher in Connecticut. So this is very representative of how a defined benefit plan works. So imagine a teacher who leaves a system during a certain year in their career. So they're going to receive a pot of money for their retirement. So this shows like the lump sum value of a retirement. And so the chart shows the size of that pot for each year. Teachers in Connecticut, they don't receive a pension until they vest after 10 years. So they don't even get a pot for 9 years. The size of the pot will then grow slowly over early in their career. And then you'll notice that around mid-career, it starts to ramp up. And then when they get to their 50s, once they have worked like 20 years, put 20 years in, then it really, really ramps up, right? So the sharp jumps that you see, and it doesn't ramp up smoothly either. You know, you see these like fits and starts, these large jumps. And those large jumps represent different key retirement eligibility milestones. And so this backloading, this is just very, very common with defined benefit plans. Now, economists Bob Castrell from the University of Arkansas and Mike Podgorski from St. Louis University, they're probably 2 of the nation's premier experts on teacher pensions. And they have showed that on average, the retirement benefits for a teacher who splits a career between 2 pension systems is about half of the benefit that that teacher would get if she stayed in a single system for a full career. So you have 2 teachers, say they work 30 years. One works 30 years in one system, another, works 15 years in 2 different systems. The one that even though they might get two pension checks, the total value is going to be much smaller. And so this chart kind of shows, demonstrates that. If you can go to the next slide. So here we can see how much each year of work is worth in terms of retirement benefits. So imagine now that you have a big empty bucket, and then each year shows how much pension wealth you're putting into that bucket for different years of work. So you'll see that, some years, the first 9 years are worth nothing. Then you'll see that some years are worth a little bit. 1 year is worth a lot. And then at the end of the career, after age 62, those years are negative. You're actually taken out of the bucket by working those years. So you accrue negative pension wealth. So for a teacher who enters Connecticut's system at age 25, her 55th year of work is worth more than $120,000. So just by working that 1 year, you're putting $120,000 in pension wealth into that pot. And however, if the year before and the year after, that's worth much, much less. That's worth less than $40,000 for those years. So some of you might be wondering, is there something magical about age 55 for teachers, or something magical about that 20th year of teaching? And is there something that's about $100,000 less magical about ages 54 or age 56? So there's no research that I'm aware of that says so, but that's the system that we have. And again, after age 62, pension wealth turns negative. And so the plan works as an implicit tax on teachers after age 62. Now, some teachers may be very effective at some of these ages. Some teachers may not be effective at all. Some teachers I know are very good, even in their 60s. Other young teachers I know, they get burned out. And so this is just all indicative of these strong incentives. So you have this really strong incentive for here in Connecticut, for example, to teach, for at least 20 years or in that system. And a very strong incentive then also to push them out, past a certain point. Again, these are all arbitrary, not backed by research. And so now that we've covered what the problems are with borders in our nation's education system, Mike, what can be done about it?
So yeah, I chose this image purposefully. I hope some of you, maybe you who've had a chance to travel, recognize it. This is, of course, the Brandenburg Gate, which connected East and West Berlin, and was a the sort of border between sort of communism and capitalism, between democracy and totalitarianism. And I think part of what we were talking about in our paper, so we recognize that these borders have negative effects for students. They have negative effects for teachers. If teachers switch between states, or like in a state like Missouri, where there are different pension systems even within the state, like St. Louis and Kansas City each have their own, the rest of the state has their own. So if you move from city to suburb or suburb to city, you're getting harmed. So all of these barriers exist. They're not good for kids. They're not good for teachers. They may be kind of questionable for homeowners. So what can we do about it? What are some changes that we can make? And obviously Marty's going to talk a lot about what we can do on the sort of teacher side, but the school side and the sort of student and homeowner side is probably some of the stuff that, you all are familiar with, right? We mentioned it earlier, intra and interdistrict open enrollment. So this allows students to either move within traditional public schools within the system, in the district that they live, or cross those district borders. Things like charter schools, which are autonomous public schools that can draw from a much wider area, which is, again, breaking down or at least making these borders somewhat more porous. We still have the districts in both of these options. School districts still exist. Those schools still exist. All of that stuff is still there. But you're just kind of poking some holes in those barriers, allowing folks to move between them. And then you can take on, I think, much more sweeping steps where you do things like education savings accounts, where suddenly a lot of those borders don't matter anymore because students are not within the traditional public system, and they're finding they could be actually pulling together resources from multiple different places around the country or even around the world using their education savings accounts dollars to do that. And so one question, of course, I think that we have to ask is like, what do we think would happen? Like, what do we think is going to happen when these? So obviously we at EdChoice cover a lot of the research on these topics, but I want to actually give a real world example because I think, and because we're with a group of school choice advocates, me telling the story that says, a rising tide lifts all boats, which I agree with and I think is true, may not necessarily be the most helpful. Because oftentimes when we talk about things like interdistrict enrollment, when we talk about school choice, we have concerned people who live, who bought houses, as we talked about, with values that are capitalized in their quality schools. Hey, I bought a house in this district because it's, because it's a good district. I paid more for this house. All you school choice nicks are going to take away some of the wealth of my home, or not necessarily give the same opportunity. I thought my kids were going to get basically the first access or the sole access to these schools. Now a bunch of other kids get to go to them. And I think that that's actually a real concern, and it doesn't help for school choice advocates to sort of sweep that under the rug and say, oh, no, everything will be better. We have to think about, well, really, what would that mean if suddenly some of these districts that were able to sort of have these borders around them allowed students from other places to come in? Now, luckily, we have some real world examples of this, and I think it should assuage some of the fears of these folks. Which again, I don't mean to sort of downplay. I think those are reasonable criticisms and something that we have to take seriously. I just want to give an example from the state of Arizona. Scottsdale, I don't know, maybe some folks here have vacationed there. Lovely part of the world. a really kind of affluent suburb of the city of Phoenix. A few years ago, Arizona instituted an inter-district open enrollment program. So allowing students there have, you can see there's the sort of open enrollment process that exists. So lots of students there, as part of state mandate, are able to transfer between districts, are able to transfer within districts. And so you look at a district like Scottsdale, say, oh, that's probably a rather desirous place for people to go to. Would they want to participate in it? Would it benefit from them? And one of the things that we see just in the data is a lot of kids in Scottsdale participate in this program. They take in 3,800 out of district students from their 22,000 total students. And then within their district, 5,500 of their own students go somewhere else. Now, that might be just they're not assigned school within their district, or that could be crossing district boundaries to go somewhere else. So what we're actually seeing there, I think there may be some belief, oh, we have this great suburban school district that's highly rated, whatever, we'll just be taking in lots of kids from other places. And there's fears about that. Well, it turns out Scottsdale takes them in, loves and takes the money that comes with them. And so a lot of really positive things happen to that. I don't think, there are opportunities in Arizona for districts to limit the number of students that come in. Scottsdale really doesn't seem to be doing that to a large degree. And then again, their own students, even though it's a great district and you can look at all the metrics and it's performing really well, even great districts aren't great for everyone. Even great schools aren't great for everyone. So again, a substantial proportion of their own students move around to other districts. But to me, places like Scottsdale are a story that says, listen, this is good, that folks that are zoned for great districts now could actually really benefit from these programs as much as students that are currently zoned for low-income students, for lower performing districts. So I think there's a lot of fear-mongering that's done around these programs, and I don't think that when we actually look at where they're instituted in other places, where we make some of these borders more porous, these things tend to succeed. Now, again, tied into the same concern, and part of what we wanted to do with this paper was take on this idea of some folks saying, I don't like school choice because I'm worried what it's going to do to the value of my home and the opportunity for my students or for my children. And I think the right way of looking at this is when people raise that concern, they're actually only talking about one half of the ledger. Because on one half of the ledger, yes, we do have the capitalization of home values, which is to say, I have basically exclusive access to this high quality public school. That's going to raise the value of my house. So on our little scales here, that would sort of tip it down in its direction. But what people leave out is that there's actually an emerging body of research, and I think this is only going to become more pronounced, that areas with robust school choice are actually really attractive for people to move to and for businesses to locate. So if you imagine you're starting a business somewhere, you're going to try and recruit people from outside of the state or outside of the country. If you can make a pitch to them rather than saying, hey, listen, yes, we're putting our new corporate headquarters here, but you're going to want to live in one of these 4 areas because that's where the good public schools are. And you're basically going to have your own people bidding against each other to drive these home values up. Anytime any new sort of great thing happens, it just makes the problem that much worse. Instead saying, oh, no, actually, this whole region, you can kind of live anywhere here because we have these open enrollment programs, we have charter schools, we have private school choice programs, we have all of these ways where you live isn't necessarily connected in that. You're actually going to save a bit of money on your house when it comes in. So it's actually much more attractive for businesses and for people that are there. So I think that we don't have a definitive answer of how this weighs out. Maybe different people might weigh it out differently, but anytime you're in a discussion with someone talking about, well, what does school choice mean to the value of my home? It's really, really important that we talk about both sides of the ledger. Yes, some people may lose some of the value in their house if suddenly other kids are able to attend the school that their home is zoned for. But you have to look at the macro effects of what that system looks like, whether the state is more attractive or the region or locality or whatever. So I think that that's a way of really thinking about what any of those types of programs might look like. And so that's the sort of traditional set of school choice stuff that we like to talk about, right? Whether it's within the traditional public schooling system, whether it's public charter schools, or whether it's in the private school choice system. But our paper also talked about some things really broadly within the public school system about how to break down some of the barriers for teachers so that teachers might be able to be more mobile. So I'll turn it back over to you, Marty, for that.
Yes. So we have school choice, on the march across the country. It's really expanding and becoming more and more popular. How about also having teacher choice? So states could offer benefit choice by offering retirement plans that work well for all teachers, rather than just having one plan that works well only for full career teachers. And then states can reform these. They could also reform plans to accomplish this and make them more portable as well. They can offer alternative plans that work better for mobile non-full career teachers. So what, if a state has only a defined benefit plan, they might offer a hybrid, or which is what Virginia actually has, or offer for a 401k style defined contribution plan, where teachers would have access to both employer and employee contributions, and they're able to take the full, their full account balances. And there are ways to make these changes to currently existing plans as well. What matters less is plan type. Plan type doesn't really matter that much. What matters is how a given plan is designed. And so having plans where benefits accrue smoothly, and they remove these arbitrary rules and incentives, that'll help teachers go a long way to to put them on a secure retirement path. But just simply offering a defined contribution, or like a 401k style, that's not going to really solve it, because you can have really well designed defined benefit plans, and you can have really poorly designed defined contribution plans. But whatever it is, the goal should be to allow as much portability for teachers, so that when they do make decisions about where they're going to work, where they're going to move, when they're going to retire, they're not going to be, their retirement lives are not going to be placed at risk because of the plan. Next slide, please. And so having a retirement system that works well for all teachers, I think that's just going to make the teaching profession more of just that, a profession. It will put teachers on a more secure path to retirement, and and some of these reforms can remove those weird peculiar incentives that really creates a wedge in the teacher labor market, and makes and so you can make teaching more dynamic, so teachers can move more freely across settings, and they can find the best setting that fits their circumstance, and they can leave at a time that fits their life circumstance and family circumstances as well. So that's all for our conversation. I think that we have some time to answer some questions. So yeah, thanks for listening.
So, okay, well, great. Michael and Marty, thank you for that presentation. Can everybody hear me okay? Am I unmuted? Yes, good. Yeah, so you, as you were presenting, I had all these questions, but you kept answering my questions, so that's a good thing. Yeah, so we had a few questions that came up when people registered, and I'd like to go ahead and start with those. One of them is, somebody said they're very concerned about the impact on the taxpayer with some of the suggestions you're making. You guys want to touch on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think that obviously it's something that we need to care a lot about, and part of what we really think about is like a word like accountability, right? We want that the dollars that we spend for education, we want family schools, we want accountability for those dollars. We want to make sure that they're going to their best and highest use. I think the probably best argument can be made that by giving those dollars as close to directly to families as possible, ensures the highest level of accountability that we can have. We have a lot of these other kind of Rube Goldberg devices that states have made. I know at least in Missouri, or I would imagine Virginia, you can pull up their ESSA plan, whatever they submit to the feds about what their accountability system has to look like, what's measured, and then how it's put into various formulae to figure out how they rate schools and whatever. And you can see that it's just very quickly becomes kind of gobbledygook, that you're like, I don't know what the heck's going on with this or what it's doing. All of that sort of this apparatus exists because of we have this more sort of centrally planned system and others. When you decentralize that and you put parents in charge, they have their own eyes, their own ears. They can observe what their child is doing. They can go to the school, or they can see what students are doing. And especially with something like an ESA or anything like that, you have this ability to sort of differentiate between individual providers in ways that we wouldn't be able to see before. So there's a lot of, again, lower barriers. So if it's like, if this isn't working, we're going to go somewhere else. If this is better, we can move to there. So, I think that, one of the things that we've seen in a lot of the school choice research, that even in some of the cases where the academic results might have been a little bit underwhelming, where like the students, if you compare the sort of test scores or outcomes between the two groups of students who got vouchers and students who didn't, and they're about the same, oftentimes what's left out of that story is that the vouchers were funded at like half of what the traditional public schools were getting. So getting the same result at half the cost actually seems pretty good to me. So I think we have lots of evidence that these private school choice systems and others really do get a lot of bang for the taxpayer's buck.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Michael, that on the ESA, for example, we're talking about educating a child for 1/3 the cost on average in the state of Virginia, right? Because the state portion follows that child. That's the only taxpayer money going for that child's education. So you're actually reducing the tax burden. Now, whether the localities actually reduce the tax rate, because they don't have the same demand on the public schools is a whole nother question. I tend to see the opposite. And at least where I live anyway. You guys talked about the Scottsdale example of intra-district schooling. Is there an example where you saw where they had intra-district schooling, but it was an inner city where the schools are terrible, and you had an affluent community right next door where the kids could actually, from that inner city, could actually access the schools if they had transportation? And has there been an example of that? Because my sense is in that situation, you wouldn't have a lot of students flooding from the affluent community into the inner city community. Can you address that a little bit?
I mean, I will say in Arizona, Scottsdale's sitting right there next to Phoenix, which is a large urban district. But there have been some examples in the past. Historically, a lot of the inter-district choice was actually related to desegregation orders. So there were efforts to sort of have students sort of mixing across, whether it was majority minority districts moving out to majority white districts and vice versa, to try and help with the sort of segregation numbers or integration numbers that were existing there. But I think Arizona gives us probably the best real world test that we see. But one of the things that's interesting to add in about Arizona, which is a slight complication on all of this, is that Arizona, in addition to this open enrollment system, has an incredibly robust charter school system. I think about 20% of kids are in charter schools, and their private school choice is ramping up as well. So it's a state that's finally sort of seeing these things where people are free to move around. So they're just not as, they're just not as hemmed into one place. So it's like, what's funny is a lot of the stuff that we might think matters or that advocates or people get all worked up about, like parents just don't see, like they don't care. Like they don't care what's a public district or a charter school or a private school or whatever. They're just, well, what are the options sort of around me? What are the best ones for my kids? And they go there, and some of them pick traditional public schools, some of them pick charter schools, some of them pick private schools. But But they are. I mean, you see inner city Phoenix kids going out to Scottsdale, and because some of these new schools have been created, you do see kids from Scottsdale going into Phoenix.
Yeah, so we're getting a lot of questions concerning the teacher pensions and some of the stuff you addressed. You mentioned it in Virginia. I thought you said that actually in Virginia teachers have a state pension. Is that correct? Do localities provide part of that pension as well? And is that what's keeping teachers from moving around from district to district? How is it working in Virginia, and what can we do to improve it, to make it easier for teachers to move around?
Yeah, so usually teachers can move around within states across district boundary freely without incurring any penalty. It's typically the state will put in some percentage of wages for contributions, and employees, teachers, workers will also put in their own contributions as well. Where they get hammered is if they switch across sector. So you have this invisibility like sector divide. So if you move from public to a private school halfway, midway through, that can, you can take a pretty big hit there. Or if you move across boundaries. And so Missouri, so there are some localities too that have their own pension system. So for example, Chicago has their own, although in Illinois, they have what's called reciprocity. So you can move from Chicago systems to the state system without having any penalty. Missouri is a basket case because it has the state retirement system, and then St. Louis City has its own retirement system, and Kansas City has its own retirement system. They do not have reciprocity. So if you move from, say, St. Louis to the state system or to Kansas City, then you're going to take a hit. You're not going to, in any years that you work outside is not going to be able to contribute to where you worked before, or vice versa. And so yeah, I think it's going to depend. As far as I know, yeah, I think like with Virginia's system, it's a hybrid. So there is some portability, because a hybrid is, about roughly half the benefits are part of it. It's based on a defined benefit, but then a part of the plan is based on a 401k style defined contribution plan. So it does have a more portable component to that.
And how do you change that? Is that got to go through the state legislature?
Yeah.
I assume. Yeah. And how are the unions, the education unions, dealing with this? Are they open to this? Because I mean, it is helping teachers, so you would think that this would be something they'd be interested in. But then again, I don't always know that I can predict what the unions are going to do. Yeah,
well, anything that can bring in more money, they will be for that. And these pension plans also, keep in mind that they are very complex. They're hard to understand. And usually newer teachers may not even hardly know what a pension is. And so it's easier for the unions to, I think, make changes based that they want, and to push those through, just because they have incentives to help folks who have been members for a long time, who have been in the system for a long time. I'm not sure, Mike might have some stories.
Oh, geez. I was just going to say, I would say the two things of the sort of political economy of all this. Obviously, Marty has forgotten more about this stuff than I know, but the research that I've done on these things, still to this day, the most controversial piece of research that I've ever done in my entire life, and I write about school choice and all sorts of stuff that you would think would be rather controversial. I had this crazy idea. This was back when I was in the state of Missouri. There was some talk about reforming teacher pensions. And so I had this wild hair to just survey teachers about what they might want out of their pension system. Seemed relatively innocuous to me. Myself and another researcher, we worked with some school superintendents and some of the teacher preparation programs, got their kind of seal of approval that they said, hey, these are legit or whatever. And so we sent out we used their kind of list to email people. The unions just blew the whole thing up. And what's crazy about it is they made this like Facebook post about us and what horrible people we were because we were trying to cut people's pensions or whatever it was. About every 6 months, it goes viral again. So this was a paper that we did. Some people participated in it. We published it 5 years ago. Still, every 6 months, this thing goes viral. And I get like emails from people saying, what are you doing with this survey? And I send them a link. I was like, it was written 5 years ago, folks. You can, and again, these are the people that are in charge of worrying about what misinformation is. But so I think you have this system. And I think what actually ends up happening, because I saw some questions in the chat about sort of how does change happen in these areas. I think what's unfortunate about it is these systems have to get to a sort of crisis. We look in places like Illinois or where was it, Rhode Island or any number of these places. And the really sort of terrible thing that happens is that as these programs, and some people were talking about sort of the funding of these pension systems and underfunding of these pension systems, what happens is just little by little, teachers are asked to contribute more and more, right? So when the pension system isn't working, maybe they kicked in 8% and then it becomes 9% and then it becomes 10%, then it becomes 11%. Before you know it, teachers are chilling out. I mean, there was that horrible system in Illinois where you had young teachers, basically, I think, was it 3.5% or something that just was shaved off the top, money that they would never see because it had to bail out these systems. And unfortunately, it tends to be like teachers, it's because it's, you know, what, the frog boiling in the pot. They don't necessarily see until suddenly 10 or 15 years later, it's like, whoa, our contributions have gone way up. So it's tough absent some of those things where you really see these stark problems. But I think, frankly, that is when we talk about how we sort of change some of these systems, talking to teachers that are like, you know, you realize that your contributions keep going up, but your benefits don't keep going up. When somebody's, yeah, you're worried about your benefits freezing, but your contributions are going up. That's not good. The system shouldn't be working like that. So maybe we should talk about ways in which what you contribute is much more tightly linked to what your benefits are.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I want to switch gears just a little bit. There's a question about ESAs, and it's not exactly what this call is about, but somebody asked a question about how do ESAs impact maintenance and new building construction? And I can answer that question, but I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts because it may be different in different states.
I mean, at least what I've been seeing so far is a lot of ESA programs are encouraging the use of kind of non-traditional school buildings. So a lot of the learning programs and stuff that are happening out of there are in really kind of like cool spaces that people have found that are smaller, sort of more integrated into neighborhoods or closer to other businesses or closest to jobs. So I think in some ways I'm seeing it's just a sort of shift of what is being defined as a kind of space for education. So it's so it's sort of a mix. I think there's definitely being some investment in some of those areas. People are rehabbing office spaces or they're rehabbing old buildings or whatever to make them learning environments.
Typically in Virginia anyway, the way the ESA legislation has been written here is that, you know, you're taking approximately a third of the money, and that's an average thing. We know about averages, but capital expenditures are a separate expense in Virginia. So that's not included in the per pupil expenditure. So that's totally different funding. Secondly, we leave enough funding behind that your fixed costs are covered for your public school systems. So the ESA does not impact maintenance or capital expenditures in Virginia. And I think this is typical for most ESA programs around the country. Now, we do have some localities here that depend highly on the state portion, and those are things that we need to be looking at and addressing. There are some counties that get 80, 75, 80% of their funding comes from the state, which is really very high, whereas the average is 35% typically. So I hope that answers that question. Let's see, what time have we got? Okay, we're at 12:55. I guess we have a time for one more question. Let's see here. Talk a little bit about the wealth distribution that you guys were talking about. Maybe go a little deeper into how that impacts communities when you offer more choice in education and kids can actually go over the boundaries or go from one district to another district, whether it's at ESAs or it's interdistrict schools.
I don't know, Marty, if you want to take a first stab at, or I will, what do you?
Yeah,
Whatever.
I mean, I think that
Yeah,
it's
Marty's an economist. I'm more of a political scientist. Marty's more of an economist. So it's like I vaguely heard numbers in that question. And I was like, I'm going to defer to him.
well, so I think what we see, at least in research, is that housing prices across communities are going to actually narrow. So when you open up the borders, so to the families from wealthy areas, might want to move into lower income areas, and allow kids from lower income areas access schools from wealthier areas. As Mike said, mentioned before, we'll see that housing prices will drop a little bit when in the higher income areas, but they're going to increase, they're going to raise property values in the lower income areas. And the research shows that overall, like on net, property values are going up. And so we also see then quality goes up too. The research is pretty clear that when you have choice, when choice enters the picture, it really is a tide that lifts all boats. The vast majority of almost every study has been over 24 on the competitive effects of choice, shows that public schools improve. Students' outcomes improve. Students who remain in public schools, they do better. Students who remain in public schools, they have lower absenteeism, lower suspension rates. Parents are happier about that, about the programs and their schools, and you just end up with a better optimal match between the learning environment that kids end up in. And this also, I think, so it helps communities. The research also shows that schools become more integrated. The economist Ben Scafferty, he showed that there was this anomaly that over time, since the 80s, even though neighborhoods became more integrated, the public schools have become more segregated with it. So there is some research that shows, though, that when choice enters the picture, you also end up with more school integration as well. So there are all these, I think, effects on students, communities, that tends to lean positive.
Yeah, I think that, that's everything that I've read as well. And there's a great piece that, and I forgot who else he wrote it with, but Jason Bedrick, you guys are familiar with, who's afraid of school choice. That's something that was written last year. I highly recommend people go and look that up online. It goes to EdChoice's website. I think it's the first thing that pops up on Google is who is afraid of school choice. And he covered all those things you just talked about, Marty. How public schools perform as a result of more choice being introduced into a district. And unfortunately, our opponents on this, they just don't want to recognize that data. They just, and just last thing I'll share before we close is in the subcommittee hearing where we had the ESA bill first heard, one of the opponents came up and she referred to one study on Louisiana after, I know you're familiar with it, after Katrina, and it showed, it didn't work. They referred to one study. They didn't refer to any other study. Of course, the patron of the bill was pretty animated when he got back up to retort, and he said, "Yep, you're ignoring all the other studies that are out there," and so forth and so on. So that's the challenge we have here in Virginia. But as I said earlier to you folks, to you and Mike and Marty, before everybody got on, in Virginia, we are going to have to get Democrats on board, and everybody listening right now needs to understand, most states have passed this, all states have passed education choice with just Republican votes. We don't have that luxury here in Virginia. So we're going to have to work on legislators, and I do believe that it can be done. In Florida, it took a while. It took a long time before they got Democrats on board, but they finally did because they saw the success of school choice in Florida. And so that's what we got to do here. We got to demonstrate that. So I want to thank you both so much for joining us. This was really good timing for us. Just for everybody that's on the call, next month, I've invited Congressman Bob Good to talk about the federal tax credit program legislation that they're talking about up there. I know there's a lot of concern about federal dollars or any government dollars going into education. And so we're going to talk about those concerns as well. But I've invited him, and I think he's probably going to join us. So that'll be next, what are we in April? So it'll be May. I don't know the date, but it's the first Thursday of the month. So Mike and Marty, you're welcome to join us next month as well. And we'll have, hopefully we'll have the congressman on. So again, I want to thank everybody for their time today and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.